And welcome to the React Show. Once again, I think we're going to have a lot of fun today. It's going to be an interesting episode. So, if you saw the title, I think hooks suck. Well, technically, I think the API sucks, not necessarily the underlying idea, although I have issues with that too. And we're going to talk about why that is and, you know, what we could do, to sort of mitigate some of the downsides and what I think the React team could do to make things better. So, yeah, it's going to be quite a show, I think. But yeah, it'll be a lot of fun nonetheless. Um, we're with Owl Creek, a high performance React consultancy. And once again, I'm your host, Thomas, and with my co host here, Austin. Welcome to the show, Austin.
Howdy, hey.
Hey.
Hi.
Yeah. Like always, feedback and questions, please send them to the React Show at owlcreek.studio. I think we'll get right into it because I'm sure everyone is dying to know why I say hooks suck. You know, Hooks came out and they seem to have been taken up really quickly by the React community. If you're like whipping out some new class-based components nowadays, people will sort of look down upon you maybe. So it's definitely like expected right now that you are writing function components with hooks. But I think while hooks are probably overall a general improvement over the class-based component design, they have a lot of flaws. So I'm curious, Austin, have you worked much with class-based components?
Yeah, I got into React where it was primarily class based. Like it wasn't at the level of like create element and stuff. But yeah, I got in with classes, and when like ES6 was starting to come out where you could write directly in like these static things like state inside, and um yeah, I think they're just a little overly verbose. I think I don't think there's anything wrong with using class-based components. I do think that the component life cycle is, though it is more verbose, I think you can handle things better than with hooks in some instances. Like getting the previous props or previous state on some of the switches is a lot easier to manage these things versus like creating additional hooks to handle all of it. And you're kind of like limited in a way with what you could do with the component lifecycle in a class-based component. But like I don't know if that limitation was necessarily a bad thing because it like enforced some sort of standardization.
Yeah, I think you bring up a point I wanted to bring up as well, which is the class-based components. I don't know that there was. I mean, I do think there were things wrong with that API as well, and one of them, like you said, was the verbosity. I think tied to that is my general dislike for the way this is integrated with JavaScript and prototypical inheritance. I found that could complicate things in React-based components if you didn't really understand what was going on in some cases, and it was just it was too much writing to do a lot of things. I totally agree with that. You know, I do think it's interesting though that we compare what we have now to then. So I'm curious, Austin, what do you think of our newer function-based components with hooks as compared to the class-based ones? Like I know you generally write or always, I think I've only ever seen you write a function-based component. Why is that? Why do you do it that way?
Well, it's kind of like tied into this concept of bottom up programming, right? Like, I don't necessarily need access to all the things that are available within a class component when I'm creating something, right? And then I think that the invention of hooks, so usually you're just literally returning like any React component has to return some JSX, right? So it's like that's your baseline need. And then like maybe you don't need access to state, maybe you don't need access to lifecycle components or callbacks or any of these things. So it's like using functions allows you to like start with the bare minimum of what you really do need, and then as you find, okay, like where do I need to bring, like what more do I need to bring in, you can then kind of bring them in as you choose.
So that makes sense. Does that mean that sometimes you do use a class-based component when you want some of those other features?
Actually, no, because I don't feel like I have, by the time I've gotten to a place where I'm like, oh, it would, maybe a class would have been better, I usually never get to that realization anyways. I don't feel like I've come across any where I'm like, I really wish I had a class right now instead, you know.
Hmm.
I mentioned that previous props and previous state, which would have been like, oh, that would have been nice. But usually at that point, your component is so like complex in its own right that it's like switching over to a class based one. Is it going to be worth it? I don't know. Yeah, I pretty much only do functional components at this point.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense actually, and I didn't think of that. Yeah, once you've reached the point where you want some of the tools in a class-based component, it's probably not worth it anymore to convert to one. And I think that brings us to our main topic, which is hooks. So if you didn't have hooks, you would have to convert to one, and that's what we used to do, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So hooks clearly are, providing things that we need to make our components, right? And everyone is using them, and maybe it's for the reasons that Austin laid out. We start with the function-based component, we don't need anything else, then we can just sort of add things as we go. I think that makes a lot of sense. I suspect there's probably other reasons as well. I personally, um, I like the function-based components because of their sort of flow. So in a function-based component, you just start at the beginning of the function and you read to the end, and that's the order in which React is going to more or less execute your code, aside from things like use effect. Um, that makes it, to me, I really like that. I really like being able to just read through it like that and okay, I know what's going on. The class-based component was definitely, in my mind, a lot more fragmented in figuring out what it's going to do, but I don't think it was like that much worse. I think it makes sense to me why. So there's some underlying reasons, I guess. I'll say I know about from the React team for why they are moving towards function-based components and hooks. One of them you'll notice is if you have like hot refresh or hot reload or whatever, it generally works better if you have function-based components with hooks than with class-based components. And that is really pointing towards, like, I think the main reason why React is moving towards function-based components, and it's actually internal reasons. Their ability to do the things they wanted to do with a class-based approach was being limited, and so they found this other approach that works, and they have published that to us in the community, and now we're using it with but this is where I start to have major issues, and that's with the introduction of hooks. I think it made a lot of sense that they added them because we couldn't do a lot of things that we wanted to do with function-based components, and they wanted us to switch to function-based components. So that makes sense. But where I get unhappy is with a number of design choices they made. And so as we talk about a lot of this, there's going to be things that I might say are wrong that you might be doing. in how you use hooks. And I want to make it really clear, I'm not criticizing any individual out there who is using this API. I'm talking about, the API design itself. And so there's things that we can do with what I consider to be a not very good design to make our code better. But I'm not criticizing anyone directly. So, I definitely have to make sure I say this so I don't hurt Austin's feelings, because I know,
Yeah,
it'd be very easy for me to do in this case. But
yeah, I'm quite fragile, especially today. No, I appreciate, like, I don't want to feel, I don't think anyone should take these things personally. It's a great time to learn, like, especially, like, as, like we mentioned before in Why You're Using Effect Wrong, the other podcast, like, as we continue to use them incorrectly, not of our own fault, like, we kind of are like creating these standards and paradigms that could like even shift how the future implementations of the library have an effect on your code, right? So implementations, I mean. So like if we're writing them all incorrectly and then React does some sort of paradigm like correction and it could break a lot of people's code, or if we've all written them so improperly, like the amount of like hackiness that they're going to have to do to make everything backwards compatible could be quite weird and make React like start to get away from the tool that we love. So I think it's really good to overview these things of why they aren't good, to look at like what can be improved.
yeah, I agree. And I definitely have to thank Austin for, reminding me to say that. I was pretty fired up about this topic in the show notes and didn't remember to include that disclaimer. So, yeah, thanks, Austin, for reminding me. Yeah, I'm fired up about this because, I have run into these design flaws, which I still haven't defined yet, but I've run into them causing problems numerous times in code bases, and it makes me unhappy. So I don't know, maybe I'm just going to rant about it. Hopefully not. We'll try to do this in a structured way. But yeah, I think I'll just get into it. So, what is it I'm talking about? What is it about the hook design that I dislike? Now, there's two main things. I'm going to start with one thing, which is the strict order requirements. So if you read the React docs or pay attention to like the default ESLint warnings for React, you will quickly find out that you cannot do a use something, a hook of some kind inside a conditional. It must always be called, and it must always be called in the same order. I really think that's poor design. We'll get into why that is and what we could do about it later on. But I really dislike that. And I don't think I'm alone in that. I think nearly everyone I know has expressed, frustration about that requirement. I don't know. Does that cover you, Austin?
Yeah, it's interesting because like if they were to be able to be called conditionally, I feel like it would be a code optimization instead of like running these effects and then determining that you can't run anything within them, right? It feels like that itself would be an optimization.
Yeah. We'll talk more about that implementation detail, but you're absolutely right. The other big issue I have with not all of the hooks, but some of the hooks, is the ones that take a dependency array. And we've definitely talked about this before on the show because I get really fired up about it. But I I'm really this is the main thing I'm really unhappy about because in my opinion, they did not need to add it to the API the way they did. There might be reasons for why that type of functionality needed to exist, but the way it's been added to the API, I think, has led to most people telling me either I don't really understand the dependency array, I don't, or them just misusing it based on, some tutorials or examples, or in some cases, even some things that are said in the React documentation. yeah, so I think that, when we'll get into the details about why it's not necessary for them to have done it this way, and why, and what they could do about it. But those are my two main gripes. And along with that, I would say with the dependency array, I think the documentation around that on the React website is not good. And so I think that leads to a lot of people having misconceptions about what it's for and when you should use it. Yeah, so that's my quick summary of the two. I have some other minor things which we'll get into, or more major. We'll get into it later. Like, do we even need hooks? Is there a better way to do it? That type of thing. But those are my two main issues with the API design as it exists right now. I'm curious if you had any thoughts on that, Austin.
Yeah, it, it just brings me back to how, like, with the introduction of them and them being this like new feature, that they kind of became like every problem became a nail and the hammer to use was hooks. And
Yes.
there have been many times that I've been catching myself where I'm like, wait, why am I like doing this stuff after the fact and like actually creating more re-renders of my component than I should be? Just instead, like on the click handler itself, I can do all the logic I need. And I've been catching myself repeatedly doing that, and I'm like, like I need to make sure that I use these a lot more smart, because they're not that smart sometimes to use.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I'm trying to remember the timeline too. Are I was trying to just figure this out spur of the moment as well, but like, are they still considered experimental? Do you know?
I think they were in the last version, but now that we're on like 17
18
officially,
or 17? Yeah,
are we
yeah.
on 18
No,
now?
no, you're right. 17. I was thinking ahead.
I
Yeah.
think they were experimental in 16, and
Okay.
they're like they were officially supported in 17.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. That seems to map with what I am remembering and seeing. Yeah, I do think part of it could have been the uptake on it seemed to happen really fast, even when it was experimental. So I don't know if the React team might have changed their design if it hadn't been adopted so thoroughly so quickly. I'm really not sure, but yeah. So
Well, functional programming in general was like a huge like ray. Everyone was like, oh, functional, all the things like they had just discovered all the JavaScript community like in
mm,
mass. So yeah, I think that spurred this massive adoption.
it, I mean, that's where like too. I think I don't I mean I don't know. I don't know if technically this is even functional programming, to be honest. In a lot of ways I don't think it is. So I think you're right. I didn't
Right,
even think of that. It looked like it. And so people were like, "Yeah, let's
right,
jump on it." Which is funny. I've been, someone primarily writing, functional and purely functional code for a long time, and feeling like in a lot of cases it is the better way to write code. But I think you're right. It's an interesting sort of side effect of this idea taking off in a community that might not actually have known about it fully, or had as much experience with it.
right. Yeah, it was just like I know that this like people were just starting to figure out what it meant to do functional stuff, and yeah, it's like use state. Oh, that's a function, so it must be functional programming.
Yeah, yeah, exactly what I meant. Um, yeah, so we can get into why things are the way they are, because I think that's important for understanding what we can do about it, and what the possible options are. So the first one is the strict order requirements on when hooks get called. Yeah, I have no idea. I'm springing this on you, Austin. Do you have any idea why that is? Or maybe you read the show notes, but
Why it is? No,
yeah.
I didn't get through the show notes. I
Okay.
know that they get called after like a render occurs, and then they get called afterwards. after that initial render,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah, but
I don't know why.
yeah. Okay. Cool. That's great. So so there is a reason, and React even documents this. The reason is like say you have two like a use state call. React needs to know which use state call it's executing between function calls. So like conceptually your JavaScript functional React component is just a JavaScript function, right? So React, invokes that function every time it wants to do a render. Well, internally, because it needs to maintain some extra state between these transitions and do some other bookkeeping and stuff, it needs to know that which hook call goes to which previous state internally. Which hook call is this hook call? It needs an internal identifier. That's what it needs to be able to do what it needs to do. So that's the reason why this exists, because React is like, oh, if we make sure the hooks always get called in the exact same order, we will know which hook maps with our internal state from the previous time we did a render. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah,
Because like there are multiple use effects that can be created in one file, so it
exactly.
needs to, right?
Yeah, so use state, use effect, all of these, there's multiple. And so the
Right,
React
right.
team decided, oh, we will, they're doing what I call creating an implicit unique identifier. And that unique identifier is the order in which this hook gets called. That is the reason why you have to do hooks the way you do them. I'm curious what you think about that, Austin. Do you like that reason?
I mean, it makes sense, but it seems like a good idea, but I feel like with like using like a ton of this, like a ton of different state, like a bunch of different use effects, callbacks, this and that. If you're doing like if you have a really bloated functional component leveraging a lot of these hooks, like you could have an insane amount of re-renders occurring
Yeah, that's a good point.
due to that method.
Yeah, that is true. But this to me is an even deeper problem. This is actually what I call one of my like cardinal sins of programming. Um,
I'm
anytime you
taking
have
notes right now.
yeah, implicit things. I need a better technical term for it so I sound fancy, but having things have implicit behavior is bad. You should never do that in programming because it leads to confusion for the people using it, and it often leads to bugs. And so, obviously, in this case, we see confusion because people are like, why the hell do I like why does it matter what order I call these in? Nothing seems like JavaScript doesn't say I can't call them in this order, so why does it matter? And people don't think about that. They're just like hacking away and they add their code and then it doesn't work and you're like, why doesn't that work? That seems like it should work. But I think it can have, in this case, I don't know if there's a lot of other bad like consequences, but anything internal or so implicit like things like this can lead to really nasty bugs. Usually because people using it don't understand why it has this weird implicit thing. And the React team obviously knew this because they created an ESLint rule to let you know when you break this rule. But if you're not using that ESLint rule, who knows what's going to happen. I actually haven't tried it. Maybe they have like some internal extra bookkeeping they need to do to like handle this situation where you break that rule. But they clearly knew that they were creating this, essentially it's a new programming construct, but they had nothing built into the language to back up that construct. And so I think that's a really, really bad design choice, especially because I know of other ways, which we'll get into, that they could have done it that would have not had this issue.
What would you call them instead of hooks? What would you call them, like nooks
I,
or
I
something?
I don't know. That's a great question. I don't know that I don't know that you actually needed to change the external API at all to solve this problem. So we'll get into that, but
Yeah, I don't mind that I'm listening a lot on this podcast because that I think we've had this conversation. The reason we work well together is you're like the mechanic in the shop, like tuning up the car, like putting a time machine in it, and I'm like the crazy guy driving the thing. And so I've been driving this car without really knowing what's going on under the hood. So I appreciate your insights to the depth of these things.
oh, thank you. And it's true. You don't need to know all these internal details. But if you're,
Well, it's good to know, like, at least when the engine blows up down the road, you're like,
yeah,
something caused this, and I have no clue why.
and it is probably good to know what we talk about, what I'm saving for the end, which is what you can do to help, make sure your code doesn't have issues in the meantime. But yeah, definitely, I find learning the internals really interesting. You might not, which is cool, but yeah, well, we'll continue talking about it. So yeah, the next thing I wanted to talk about was the dependency array thing, and this is in my show notes. I have it, quote, React's fundamental flaw, which like you're like, huh? Why is the dependency array the fundamental flaw? It isn't. The fundamental flaw of React is performance. I don't know if many people know this, but a lot of the things we do in React, the fact that we even need to have hooks really at all, is because React is unable to have good enough performance to do without those extra helpers. I call those, aids, performance aids, right? For example, if you take a look at a desktop rendering system, like the example I often use, Qt, they work on more of a model where rendering is so fast that you can just do it anytime. So anytime anything changes, you can do it, once, 60 times a second. If you're making like a game type interface, you can do it a lot because it's really, really good performance. React does have better performance than some similar. What I'm talking about is the render function, rendering and updating the DOM, syncing the DOM, whatever is needed. I'm talking about that situation. React can do it faster than a lot of similar things, but it can't do it fast enough that we can just write plain vanilla code and have it work. So we end up with these other API designs like the hooks and stuff. I don't know if you did you know that, Austin?
No.
Yeah.
I'm just like, huh.
Yeah, so it's actually all related to React not being able to do what it fundamentally needs to do fast enough. And so a lot of what we're doing, a lot of our programs are purely predicated based on trying to make sure React has good enough performance. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. You know, all programming ultimately is being run on hardware, and it's all being optimized for the hardware it's being run on. And this is just another instance of that. The sort of so what the React team has had to do is they're like, okay, we can't necessarily do the ideal situation, so we're going to have to do this sort of intermediate solution, which means we can't render as frequently. Which means we need to come up with a new API to handle making this whole process more efficient. And so originally that was the class-based API, and now they have the hooks API. This, though, is where we get into sort of the nitty-gritty details of why I don't like what they did. I understand there's a need for the API to be performance focused. That makes a lot of sense to me because React can't do it can't go beyond what it can do. We're stuck with what we have. So it makes sense that they have developed this API. Now, what I don't like to see is how they mixed some of these different levels of performance optimizations without either I would say without separating them better. So while use state and use effect, etc., are essentially, for the most part, performance optimizations, they're actually pretty solid API, other than what we talked about previously for the ordering. Like, I don't really have a lot of complaints, other than the two things we talked about. But when you get into like the dependency array, so for like use effect or use callback, the reason React added that dependency array is purely 100% for performance. Because think about it this way. Say you have your use effect. You don't ever need to have that dependency array. You could have React invoke your use effect every single time it renders and put a conditional inside the use effect. And Austin and I, we've talked about this a lot, but just to make it clear, and we also talked about the use effect podcast, like you can just have a conditional inside your use effect, and every single time React will call your use effect, get to that conditional and continue or not continue. And there's a slight, performance hit because it has to, call your use effect every time. There was, from what I can tell, maybe some place in Facebook's code base or a few places where they must have been invoking that use effect an inordinate number of times. It must have been being, they must be rendering this component like hundreds of times a second or something. It had to be a really high number. And they found that small overhead of calling this use effect was a bottleneck, and they wanted to eliminate it. So they added this dependency array. I totally get that. I understand that use case. But what I don't like is the fact that is a really rare case. It's not something that should commonly happen. And even if it does happen, it's probably going to be perfectly fine adding a conditional inside your use effect. It's just very rare that running the use effect call itself is actually the bottleneck. But React just tacked on this to the public-facing API, and in its documentation, kind of implied you can even use it to only render or only run it once on the first render or something. So what I'm saying is technically I understand why they added it, and I don't think it's wrong to have that functionality, but it should have been separated, like a separate function call or something the compiler figures out on its own or whatever. Well, we can go into the specific details for how they could have done it different. But what I have found in practice is people use that dependency array for so many other reasons than it was designed for. And it leads to so many bugs. I was just working with some code yesterday that had a bug because someone incorrectly specified the dependency array. So when something was changing, the code wasn't being run when it should have been. And in that case, there was literally no reason for the dependency array to ever have been added to this code. It just wasn't necessary. But everyone seems to do it all the time. And so all I can think is blaming, the documentation and the fact that React added it there in the first place. All right. So anyways, now that I've ranted about this for a while, do you have any more thoughts, Austin?
No, it's just giving me a lot of thoughts about you mentioned that React, I believe in 18 or in future versions, they're looking at automating the dependency array to make sure it is being used. And it's interesting how we use it. It is we use the dependency array instead to do conditional render triggering. And it's interesting, even it's just still going on using it in this way. But I mean, that's where you did mention you created your own hook called use conditional hook, which allows you to kind of leverage this. Could you explain how you created that one and
Yeah.
how it kind of solves what you were talking about?
Yeah, that's a really great point. I totally forgot about that. So in this case, I was specifically looking at use effect, which the dependency array gets abused, like we've been talking about, in that fashion all the time. So, like Austin said, for sort of conditional execution, people are like, oh, I only want to run my use effect code when variable XYZ changes. So they create a dependency array, put XYZ in it. That is not what that dependency array was for, but it's used everywhere. And so I was like, okay, there is a correct way to do this. I created a new hook called use conditional effect. And it is backwards compatible with the way people were using use effect in this code base. And the way that works is it will store the previous, so it takes that like dependency array argument, which is I guess a dependency array, but really what we're calling it for use conditional effect is our conditional variables. So an array of variables that we want to monitor for changes and run the effect of this code when those variables change. So, I just implemented a simple hook that stores the previous value of each of those variables. And if any of them have changed, I run the body of the use effect. That is like the way that you should be writing these types of things. And it is backwards compatible with use effect, which is nice, although I have issues with anyways, I won't go into that. Anyways, so I have done that. And you can do that for like use callback, any of the other things that use a dependency array. You can create a backwards compatible version and update your code base to use it the right way. Now, I think that brings up a really good question of why does that matter? And that's because of bugs. So my use conditional effect will work the way the programmer intended. Use effect will not, because let's say your function body depends on the value of some variable, but you didn't put it in the dependency array because you don't care if you don't want to you don't care if that changes, or maybe you have a function, you use a function in your use effect, and maybe that can change. Maybe it's a prop that comes in or something. Like there's a lot of cases where some value, some function in your effect body can change, and you actually do want to run the body of your effect then because the value has changed, and so you need to have new output. So the use conditional effect will allow you to achieve what you're looking for. Actually, I didn't even say that right. So really the problem is you won't capture new values. So like, let's say you have a variable that's not in that dependency array list or a function or something, and that changes. You might not want to run your code right away because, like you said, you only want to run it for these variables, right, that are in the dependency array. But when you do run it, you want to pick up the current state of your program. You want to pick up these new values. That won't happen if you're not including it in the dependency array, potentially. So it will lead to bugs, and that's what I ran into yesterday. The use conditional effect will work the way you want. So that's where I basically don't use we'll get into this later, but yeah, don't use the dependency array.
Well, I wasn't aware of that point where the dependency array, more or less tried to ensure that you had the latest values and could reference them properly, and that if you didn't reference them, that you're actually potentially using stale values within the use effect versus like tangent effects running without knowing what other things are running. It's like two problems.
Yeah, I sort of glossed over some of the details because it's annoyingly complex to explain. But that's the general idea is like if you don't use it right, you will get stale values.
Right.
Yeah, so
learning new stuff every day. Thanks, man.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so let's see. Where were we? Oh yeah, so we were talking about the performance as it relates to this. And I think we've pretty well covered the why behind why I believe or why React has said things are done the way they are. Now we'll get into what I think is the really fun part is how could it be better? So the first thing we'll talk about is the order that hooks get run in, and how you have to keep them in the same order. That's because, like we discussed, they need a unique identifier. Well, guess what? There's other ways to get unique identifiers, many other ways. I really actually wish I understood why the React team didn't choose any of these other ways, but I wish I understood why. I don't know why, but there are other ways. Like one obvious example, like to start with a simple bottom up approach to this would be all of your hooks, maybe the first argument is a unique identifier that the programmer creates. It could be an integer. The first one is 0, the second one is 1, the third one is 2. Does that make sense to you, Austin? Like just numbering your hooks, your hook calls?
Like actually, you mean the internal numbering or like
So it would
the internal numbering that they do?
so what I'm thinking is right now they're internally creating these numbers or identifiers essentially. You could make it explicit. So you could be like, all right, anytime you call an effect or use a hook, using a hook like use state or whatever, the first argument has to be a unique identifier. And then internally React could use that unique identifier. This is a intermediate step in my explaining what they could have done, so don't get too caught up on how that sounds bad. But does that make sense in terms of like something that could be done?
Yeah, it sounds. I'm just, my brain is like I'm kind of like you're having me imagining all these like complex scenarios where I could like create some sort of intelligent like function that could do that kind
Yeah.
of thing, but it sounds a little too top down
No.
to share.
You're exactly right. That's where we're gonna go.
Right.
But yeah. So hopefully that makes sense though, as like a possibility. Instead of React implicitly creating this identifier, we, as the programmer, provides it to React. And that would then allow us to conditionally call our hooks. That's all it would take. Pretty cool, right? But yeah, like Austin was saying, to come up with an even better API beyond that, I would be thinking, hey, is there any way for the computer to generate that ID itself, so the programmer doesn't have to like keep track of them or create them? So you could, instead of typing in 0 for the first time, 1 the second time, 2, as your identifiers, maybe you'll call a function that generates a GUID, a completely random number that's not going to, clash with any other random numbers that you generate. So then all you'd have to do when you're calling this hook is call that, pass that function as the first argument. That'll generate a unique ID that React can use. And now you can continue using your hooks the more natural way without having to worry about what order they're called in. Are we sounding good, Austin? Does that sound like the way to go?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. I like the paradigm.
Yeah. So now, what if React was like, maybe there's a way we could do this internally or have it as a compiler step. So the programmer no longer needs to pass that first argument. We already have like the JSX compiler step, so that seems fine. Why not? Like, what's wrong with a compiler step that just went through all your hooks and, magically entered in that call to the random GUID function behind the scenes and you never saw it, but it all just worked? That sounds pretty good, right?
Theoretically, could this be created already as like a Babel compiler that could be added to your code?
I'm not an expert on that system, but I bet I'm like 99% sure you're right that it could. Yeah.
That would be pretty cool.
Yeah. I mean, the only downside is, React hooks don't take as a first argument a unique identifier. But maybe you could get a modified version of React and try it out. That would actually be interesting.
Yeah, I did some like really basic stuff with Babel transformations, and that was quite interesting. The stuff you can do with it is pretty cool. I actually feel like if you wanted to implement this into React, it would probably be the way to go, because it would provide like the actual concept taken into a practical use case.
Yeah. Um, I think that'd be really cool. I really wonder why React didn't do this. I'm sure the people on the team are very smart and they probably had some reason I don't know. But hey, I think at least we could talk about it and work on moving towards something like that, because I just don't see any reason for this limitation to exist. Like, it seems like we could get beyond it and not have this implicit rule defining how we write our programs. Yeah, so yeah, that about covers that. Now we'll get into the more interesting topic, which is our dependency array. So let's take sort of the same approach where we sort of rebuild this API our own way, right? Let's say we remove the dependency array argument to the functions, the hooks that take it, right? So imagine that's been removed. Is there again, another function that we could add that would add that functionality, or a compiler step, or, is there anything else we could do?
So instead of passing the array,
Yeah, so let's say we get rid of the array. It doesn't exist on useEffect or useCallback or any of those other ones. But we still wanted to achieve that functionality where, in that super rare case that there was so much overhead from making that initial call to like useEffect or whatever, we could prevent that from happening. So basically take that dependency array and apply it in some other way that would allow us to get the benefits without having it be a part of the normal like useEffect or useCallback API.
well, I mean, I know that you mentioned earlier that you can like do conditional checks within the callback function inside of
Mm-hmm.
a hook.
Yep.
So that's like my first thought about like having something that you call within the hook initially.
Yeah.
Um,
So what I'll say about that is maybe I'll try to re-explain some of this. So the actual bottleneck is when you do like a useEffect call in your code, React has to take that and store that for doing later after the render has completed, right? So it stores that I need to do this useEffect later, right? And then later on, it goes and it's like, okay, I'm going to go through my useEffects. And it invokes that useEffect function. And then, like you said, you could have a conditional, right? That says, oh, I don't actually want to run the body of this useEffect because my variables haven't changed or whatever, right? Like that's what we were talking about. So then it would just be done running that effect, right? That's not a lot of overhead. Like, you're not running the body of your useEffect, so it's not like you're adding a lot of overhead. But apparently that, queuing up the useEffect to run and running it was enough of a bottleneck that React added the dependency array. Yeah, does that make sense, Austin?
Yeah, completely. I'm just a real side question. So the dependency array is just an array, right?
Yeah.
That would it be possible to pass in a function that returns an array?
I don't know, actually. I don't think so, but I haven't tested it. Why do you ask?
Because I mean, it kind of gets away from what you're saying, trying to decouple the use of the array, but like perhaps there is some way that like a function could be created that would be passed in instead of the array that would be able to like more intelligently manage what is going on in the context of the component, or further up than it's like say it needs to be aware of even more things like context perhaps, etc.
Yeah, I
But
think.
I feel like this would be over engineering. I was just like, huh, can you do that?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think at least for the direction I'm imagining this different API looking, we would probably go a different direction.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. No, I'm just like
yeah, yeah,
had
no,
a
it's good
tinkering idea.
ideas. Yeah, I was just for my in my head what I was imagining, but maybe that is another approach that would work. I just haven't processed through it enough yet. But like, yeah, so what if you had another function that React provided that took a hook and like maybe a function, anonymous function that calls a hook or whatever you want to do as one argument, and the dependency array is the second argument. Uh, so in that case, you could do the same thing that React is doing with the dependency array, but not have it be tied to directly into the function call that you're using for the hooks. So use effect would not take a dependency array, but we'd have a different function called like optimize dependencies, or I don't really know what we would call it, or use performance boost. I don't know. Something funny like that would work too. But
Mhm.
yeah, so you could, if you run into this really rare case where you needed the dependency array optimization, you would wrap it in another function that handles that for you. I will say, obviously, that is not quite going to be quite as performant. You're going to have an extra instruction or two, test or a jump or whatever when this gets compiled down to assembly, relative to the solution that React has implemented. Although, depending on how they've implemented it, that might not even be true. So there, I could see how they might say, "Oh, that is too much overhead." But my response to that is, what kind of program are you writing that is too much overhead for your render function? Like, I feel like there's something else going on that you should fix before you get to this tiny level of an optimization. Like, this is a super tiny optimization. It's just, I bet you in almost no program that anyone writes in the real world, this dependency array optimization is actually going to do anything in the way that React intended it to be done or used. Like, so to me, I think it would be acceptable to have a function, another function that you use in those rare cases where you really needed to. And I think that would be awesome, because then people would stop using this dependency array the wrong way. They would just be like, oh yeah, use effect. It gets run every time. If I don't want that, I use a conditional inside my effect. Or
Right.
if you had, now take a look at this though, Austin. I don't know if you noticed this, but what was the other topic we were talking about?
The numbering, the ordering of
And
the calls.
and what does that allow us to do? If we no longer had to put those in order, if we could put them in a conditional.
We don't have the ordering at all, right?
Yep.
Or
So you can put them in a
so
conditional. So you use effect. The call to use effect itself could be inside an if statement. So then you could just check if your variables have changed or whatever before calling your use effect. Does that make sense?
yeah, I like it.
Do you know? So what that really means is there's literally no need for that dependency array at all if we had the first thing, which was the ability to call hooks inside conditionals.
This is like such a deep meta discussion on hooks. It's quite interesting because it really goes into like a completely new paradigm of something that already exists. And I feel like maybe like, do you think that there is a way that you could create like a library to implement this sort of design, or would you have to do something at the compiler level?
That is a really good question. I think the way React internally works is it depends on that implicit ordering of when things are called. So I think the only way that you could do something about it is by modifying React itself.
Right.
Yeah, I can't
Yeah, I
think of
mean
another
the
way.
things get called, like you can conditionally call a component in the render, right? So like
Hmm.
maybe and that would then conditionally call the effect, right? But I don't know if that would like achieve the desired results you'd want because like sharing and passing props might be weird. Um,
It's a great point. That would work. It would probably lead to some strange looking programs. But yeah, that would
right.
work.
It would start looking like Lisp, but with more curly braces instead of parentheses.
I might have to write a program that converts them for me to make it look cleaner.
Right.
Yeah, so I don't know. I don't know if everyone followed me through all of that, but yeah. So basically, if we had a way to call hooks conditionally, we wouldn't even need the dependency array thing at all, which would completely eliminate all of those issues and would eliminate us from even needing to come up with ways to solve that super rare performance bottleneck in the first place. But yeah, so I don't know. I had fun doing that. I don't know if anyone else did.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting. It's actually like it's quite a functional approach, like an actual functional approach to like compose functions based on like a static set of things that you're passing in, and it's quite interesting. I'm just like it's so hard to imagine this without like seeing it written in code. So I think it would be a really good opportunity to follow up this with like some conceptual models of what it would look like
Yeah, that would be
that
fun.
could be viewed.
Yeah, great point. I would like to do that. I love. I don't know. This is sort of like my. I love doing stuff like this, like designing APIs. Thinking like, okay, thinking of the programmer as a user and being like, okay, what? How are they going to perceive this? How are they going to use this? Like, and then taking that and figuring out how to create a clean, composable, workable design. It's super hard, but I love doing. I love doing it.
No, it's very satisfying.
Um,
And
yeah,
you're like talking about on a whole new level. I'm just like composing regular APIs and fun. You're like talking about like
yeah.
just endpoints
I
stuff.
mean, it's another episode I definitely want to have is my theories on how to structure like software teams. And part of that is there are people that really like using APIs and creating the programs and seeing the end product. There's also people that really like working on the internals and creating a good internal product for the rest of the team. And yeah, so we could talk about my theories on how you can structure software development teams so that you get the people that are really good at that kind of thing doing that, which makes the lives for the other programmers who are creating the end product better and ending up with a better product overall. But anyways, a separate topic. um,
Well, I feel like actually today we spawned off a potential ton of new topics for future podcasts where we can like go into some of these things and yeah, talk about that as well. So
yeah, definitely.
it's a good idea.
Yeah. So in the meantime, we'll talk about, we'll finally get to the part everyone's been waiting for, although I was waiting for the rest of it. But we'll get to the part about how you can sort of live in the situation we have today and what you can do about it, how you can write better code considering we don't have these imaginary things we just spent the last hour talking about. So the first part, which is our hooks, being called conditionally or in out of order or whatever, that type of thing, we can't do that right now. So what can you do? The number one thing is obviously you should be using the ESLint hook that lets you know if you've called things out of order, and probably, okay, definitely that should fail compilation of your program because you don't want to go down that route of breaking that rule. Like, definitely don't do that. So I think that's obvious. Probably everybody already does that. But if you don't, I would look into it. The other thing is, I don't have a lot of great solutions because it would require an internal change to React in every way I can imagine. If you know of a way to do this without internally changing React, please definitely let us know. But yeah, so in the meantime, what you can do is, first of all, don't use the dependency array. I've reached the point where I think you should never ever use it unless you have profiled your program and you have found out absolutely for sure that the overhead of just queuing up a hook and running, 2 lines of code in its body is causing you a problem. Even then, I would challenge you to find like maybe some way to render less or something. But like, yeah, that would be my challenge to you, is stop using the dependency array. I don't think it's almost ever necessary, and it leads to problems. Just probably don't use it. I jumped ahead on myself there. Yes.
Yeah, there's one that you missed.
Yeah, I'll get back to that. So yeah, that's my first thing for the dependency array. I guess, Austin, we should probably put the use conditional effect up on our website somewhere so people can find it, because it probably is useful. Or maybe we'll add that to NPM or something. Stay tuned for that. I do think that would be valuable. So that's the hook that I created that allows you to do what people have been doing with use effect, but in a safer way. It's backwards compatible. But in the meantime, yeah. So you can have, actually, this does tie into what I was going to say also about the ordering of hook calls, is you can have branches obviously inside of your hook. Now it gets complicated. So you can use that to help you with the dependency array situation. You could branch to only run your internal code, when the variable is changed, but put that branch inside the hook. So it can get complicated if you're using hooks inside your hook and you like want to conditionally invoke a hook. That's obviously you can't do that. But what you can do is have a hook API that allows you to accept a function, and internally that hook can then conditionally call it. You can pass a procedure or a value that tells it whether or not to run that conditional code. So that's kind of the sort of ugly way around this situation. Did that make sense, Austin? Do you have any other ideas?
Yeah. No, that makes sense.
All right, yeah. So
yeah, I mean, the only thing is, it's gonna be, it's just makes it things a little more verbose, right? And then you have to like perhaps leverage like this could be where we were talking all the way back in class components, where you have like easy access to the previous state and the previous props, right? I feel like those things will be perhaps more common to integrate into this approach, to like make sure that you're actually doing the conditions correct.
yeah,
So I think it'll just require some additional side paradigms.
yeah. I would say I definitely lean towards the route of encapsulating that conditional thing in like what I created, the use conditional effect. In general, that goes along with my philosophy that we should be dealing in higher level primitives than these lower level ones. But yeah, we definitely need access to previous values, and so that we can write these conditionals or write the hooks that provide that functionality that we utilize. I think that's a great approach. But yeah, so that's about all I have to rant about on this one. If you know any more about the details of why React does what it does, or if you have feedback or ideas on how to make this better, yeah, we'd love to hear from you. I would like to get some of this code up somehow. We'll have to figure that out so everyone has a way to look at it. But yeah, let us know at the React Show at owlcreek.studio if you have anything you want to say about this. And this ties in really well to where some of my knowledge on this comes from, which is Foundations of High Performance React book that I wrote. As a part of that, I studied the internals of React a lot, and got really familiar with how a lot of this stuff operates. But if you would like to also get an understanding of that, you can check out the book. It's at owlcreek.studio. We've got linked there. Sign up for the mailing list. You might be able to get to it that way. But yeah, that's about it for the show. Did you have anything else, Austin, you wanted to say to all these wonderful people out here?
No, it was really great listening, and I apologize if I wasn't that responsive. It kind of put me in like a thoughtful mode of like imagining like these things and like in my mind, and then you were like, "Hey, what are your thoughts?" I'm like, I don't really know yet. Like, I do
Yeah.
think this would be cool to touch on later, and perhaps even like take an opportunity to do like guest appearances or perhaps with people in the React community to like further facilitate this conversation. So if anyone's listening and has something to say or thoughts on these paradigms, it would be really great to reach out and get in touch. So yeah, you can do that at the React show at owlcreek.studio.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you, Austin, for fielding all of my spur of the moment. What do you think about that? What I know you probably don't have thoughts, but I thought your responses actually were really helpful and made a lot of sense. And I imagine they echo a lot of what a lot of other people were feeling. So yeah, I think that was really great. Yeah, we will see you all later. It's been a lot of fun. I'm Thomas Hintz with Owl Creek Studio, and this is Austin. We'll be seeing you later. Bye.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Bye.